we are as we meet today. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister's proposed EU withdrawal treaty has, to put it mildly, had a mixed reception. 2 cabinet ministers have resigned, along with other members of the government, and they, like MPs right across the political spectrum, object to a plan under which Britain would commit to being under the EU laws and under laws over which people in this country have no say, with the UK bound into a customs union potentially indefinitely, and so EU law. There are a number of reasons why the proposed Brexit withdrawal deal should not go ahead as it is, in the interests of economic, trade and legal independence. Our speakers today will outline some of these reasons and what change of course is needed. But there is one commanding reason on which I want to touch to open the proceedings, and that is this deal would sign away Britain's historic freedoms. Since time immemorial, people in this country have had a say in how they were governed. From Anglo-Saxon times through the barons of Magna Carta and the tumultuous battles for free trade in the 19th century, people themselves have shaped the laws under which they've been governed. Monarchs, parliaments, governments stayed in power or were removed in a country characterized by that freedom and the stability that freedom and its exercise brought to Britain. Britain, as you'll recall, was the envy of many continental powers who, even in the 20th century, succumbed to violence, often dictatorships, and unstable government. In Britain, by contrast, the universal franchise was used to topple governments, not the barricades, and usher in a new era. Winners and losers settled down to change. For example, the ballot box dispatched the historic Liberal Party after the 1918-22 coalition. It ushered in Britain's first Labour government and the second full Labour government in 1945, sending off Mr. Churchill, who had won the war. And in 1989, this country voted in Margaret Thatcher in what was to prove a revolutionary change of direction, not only for Britain's economy, but for countries right across the globe. Radical decisions, radical change, upheld by losers and winners alike. That this did not happen after the referendum is a challenge to Britain's historic freedoms and the carefully nurtured tradition which we have had historically. In the House of Commons and Lords, as you know, Remain MPs and peers sought to overturn the referendum decision, citing the interventions of CBI and other business lobbies, who, like them, had opposed the Leave vote from the outset, or campaigned even as late as this year to overturning the decision, through fair means or foul, to stay in part of the EU or the single market or some sort of quasi-customs union. This year, the government, which until then had honoured the referendum decision, decided to change course, assisted, to my mind, by the breakdown of collective cabinet responsibility. The UK, having boxed itself into the EU demands for withdrawal and timetable, now prepared to abandon constitutional precedent. By delegating negotiation of these important matters to unelected civil servants to reach deals with their EU counterparts or opposite numbers in Brussels. The Prime Minister, I'm afraid, sidelined the cabinet, presenting ministers with a fait accompli, first at Chequers and, as we saw last week, with the draft withdrawal agreement. Thus, against the best traditions of Britain's successful institutional arrangements, Remember, even during the darkest days of war, when tight security and secrecy was of first importance, Winston Churchill debated strategic and tactical options with the Defence Committee, with the Cabinet, day in, day out, debating, testing, arguing, hypothesizing with specialists, defence experts, chiefs of staff, and cabinet ministers, until a collective decision was agreed. However, we have seen one of the world's oldest and most stable democracies descend to the chaotic scenes of recent months, and the instability more characteristic of the European Union, where voters are ignored, and policy, along with the institutional arrangements that govern the bloc, designed to serve the elites that keep them in power. Mistakes have clearly been made. Had the voters' wishes been followed and the institutional arrangements designed to protect their freedom and prevent an elected dictatorship been respected, these mistakes, I am quite sure, would have been avoided. Now, as the withdrawal treaty is to make its way through Parliament, MPs and government alike should remember the warning of one of Britain's most successful 20th century prime ministers. Never forget, he told them in 1924, it is the people who put you here. It is they who will remove you. David Jones, please.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila, and may I say what a great pleasure it is to be here today to this session, which, of course, is very well timed, coming as it does less than a week after the government published its draft withdrawal agreement. And indeed, on the 14th of November, the day it was published, I happened to be in Washington. My body clock was still set to Pimlico time, and I found myself at 3 a.m., wading my way through 585 pages of impenetrable text. That, of course, was the draft withdrawal agreement. There were a handful of pages which were the draft future framework, future political agreement, but I think, frankly, for the purpose of this session, and really to all intents and purposes, we can ignore that, because it is the withdrawal agreement which I think causes me the most concern, and which I think, in all frankness, is an absolutely atrocious document. If we can just roll back to July of 2016, the country was faced with a binary choice at the referendum. The choice was, do we remain in the European Union or do we leave the European Union? And the country voted in huge numbers, 17.4 million, to leave the European Union. It was indeed the biggest vote for any cause in the history of democracy in this country. And leaving the European Union is a matter that is, if you like, quite neatly defined in Article 50, which is the article of the Treaty on European Union, which prescribes the means of a member state departure. And it prescribes that after a maximum of 2 years, after a notice has been served under that article, the departing member state will cease to be subject to the European treaties. Cease, finish, no longer be part of the European treaties. And it does seem to me that the government has tied itself up in absolute knots over what seems to be a very straightforward proposition, that we should no longer be subject to these European treaties. And the fruit of the tortuous 2 and a bit years that have ensued since that vote is this appalling document, this 585 pages, which I think amounts to the biggest threat to democracy that this country has ever faced, short of war. And I can't clearly talk about the full 585 pages in the 10 minutes or so that are available to me today. But I do want to focus on what I consider is one of the greatest threats of this document. And that is the issue of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Because I believe that the sovereignty of the European Union resides in the European Court of Justice, And if we remain in any sense subject to that jurisdiction, after our departure, our nominal departure from the European Union, we cannot be said truly to have regained our independence from the European Union, and indeed we cannot be said to be a truly free country. The document provides for two stages. There will be a transitional arrangement which will last for, at the moment it appears to be about 2 years, but there's talk, as you know, of another 2 years, and possibly the can will be kicked down the road even further. But after the end of that period, then some permanent arrangements come into place, and these will remain until such time as whatever political agreement is arrived at for the future relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom. I don't believe that we can count on that future arrangement ever coming into place, and indeed I think it would be highly dangerous if we were to make any assumption as to whether or not that will come to place. I think that what we must do is to focus unremittingly upon what are the arrangements that will take effect during the transitional period and afterwards in default of that political agreement. I have to say that this is a deeply disturbing state of affairs. After the transitional period, the withdrawal agreement will continue until it's replaced by whatever may emerge from those political negotiations. As I say, this may be a very long time indeed. And really, there is very little incentive for the European Union to move on to the next phase, because after all, why should it? Where is the incentive? It will, of course, have the benefit of a market in which it has currently a surplus of about £95 billion in terms of trade. It would be retaining the United Kingdom in the customs union and thereby preventing the UK striking free trade agreements with other economies around the world. And it's very hard to see why the EU would want to depart from these arrangements. And if it's reluctant to do so, it needn't do so, because it's quite clear from the withdrawal agreement that unless there is mutual agreement between the UK and the EU, then these conditions will prevail. These arrangements will continue. We will continue to be subject to the customs union, and we will have no input into the formulation of the laws and the regulations that will be governing our lives. After transition, of course, EU law will continue to apply. It will apply to citizens' rights during the lifetime of those who have the benefit of residence in the UK. More importantly, in terms of Northern Ireland, it will apply to all EU customs rules and a large number of single market rules. And in terms of the whole of the United Kingdom, EU law will prevail in terms of customs arrangements and a lot of other arrangements. And I think it's very important to consider the wording of Article 4 of the draft withdrawal agreement, because this, I believe, is the biggest threat to the independence of the United Kingdom, because it is this article that entrenches EU law in our constitution, and from which, as I say, I believe it will be inescapable unless the EU should decide in a rather unlikely manner to allow the UK to escape from it. And paragraph 1 of Article 1 provides that the provisions of this agreement and the provisions of union law made applicable by this agreement shall produce in respect of and in the United Kingdom the same legal effects as those which they produce within the Union and its member states. It goes on to say, and this is really quite terrifying, the United Kingdom shall ensure compliance with paragraph 1, this is in paragraph 2, including as regards the required powers of its judicial and administrative authorities to disapply inconsistent or incompatible domestic provisions through domestic primary legislation. In other words, after the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972, we will be required under the terms of this provision, this article of the withdrawal agreement, to replicate exactly the same provisions so that we continue absorbing European law whether or not we like it. And then it goes on to say, and this is paragraph 5, in the interpretation and application of this agreement, the United Kingdom's judicial and administrative authorities shall have due regard to relevant case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union handed down after the end of the transition period. So in other words, what this article says quite clearly on the face of it is that if we agree to this withdrawal agreement, we will have to absorb EU law willy-nilly in a whole range of areas, and we will be bound by the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, that is all I really want to talk to you about today, because I think that that is actually enough to know. Yeah. I don't think we need to know anything more about this. What that article provides quite clearly is that in legal terms, we will continue to be bound by the laws of a foreign state, and we will be bound by the jurisdiction of a foreign court. Yeah. Now, the expression has been used repeatedly by colleagues of mine, vassal state, as to our status after our departure from the European Union. And the fact that some of my colleagues are inclined to slightly overblown and florid language, I don't think in any sense dilutes the fact that this is an absolutely appalling provision. Yeah. If you believe in your country, if you believe in your independence, you cannot possibly accept a state of affairs where a foreign court has jurisdiction over this country and where we have to absorb blindly laws generated by a foreign state. So although I could dilate on the other 583 pages, if there was sufficient enthusiasm in the room, I think I will leave you with that thought. This is a document that I believe is an affront to British democracy. I believe that it is an assault on British independence, and I can tell you now, I shall not be supporting it in the House of Commons. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Sheila. I want to focus on one aspect of the withdrawal agreement, which is deeply flawed. And this is Article 129, which has an interesting sort of magic trick in which it creates the illusion of being a concession of granting the UK power, but in fact it doesn't. So if I may, I'll read it out in its entirety. Article 129, sub 4, this is regarding international trade. During the transition period, the United Kingdom may negotiate, sign, and ratify international agreements entered into its own capacity in the areas of exclusive competence of the EU. This includes international trade, provided those agreements do not enter into force or apply during the transition period. Now, in one sense, you might look at this and say, oh, well, that's fantastic. We have our autonomy to negotiate trade agreements. We have our autonomy to sign trade agreements. This is obviously a concession by the EU. This is a fantastic compromise. But it's an illusion. Because, first of all, we knew we had these powers anyway. We didn't need to see them enshrined in the treaty. They existed as a matter of law, irrespective of this provision. But more importantly, it's an illusion because if you have no control over your trade policy, because you're effectively still an EU member, still inside the customs union, then this is meaningless because no country in the world would be interested in negotiating with you. Now, it might be different if the transition period had a clear end date, and then as you approach that end date, last few months, you might start to say, United States, Australia, wherever, we're interested in talking with you. But we can't do that because we have no idea when the transition period will end. We're already hearing that it's not going to be 2020, it's going to be 21, 22. The point is it can be renewed indefinitely. So it's meaningless. That is absolutely sleight of hand. I do believe it was designed to trick the reader into believing that there was a concession. So that brings me to the point. Why do we have a transition period at all from a trade perspective? What exactly is the transition period giving us that we didn't get during the Article 52-year period? Two plausible answers, both of which I think are spurious. First answer is time to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU. We need more time. We didn't quite have enough time to do it. We needed a little bit more than 2.5 years, and we actually need 5 years to do it. I simply don't believe that because I think we would have already had the free trade agreement in place by now. And I think that the political will hasn't been there to negotiate it, and it won't be there to negotiate it if we get two more years. And if you look at the withdrawal agreement, it talks about best efforts, attempts to negotiate a free trade agreement to conclude the transition period. And I'm looking at that and I'm wondering, what exactly can that free trade agreement possibly look like when we know the demands that the EU has already made to this date? And what I'm referring to is, if we might think, oh, well, we're going to get a Canada Plus deal at the end, which is just what we want, it's worth waiting 2 years for that, or worth waiting the transition period. There's no way that's going to happen, because the EU has said clearly they have a red line. There can be absolutely no border whatsoever of any kind in Northern Ireland, which means the only kind of free trade agreement that the UK can ever have with the EU, evidently, is a customs union of the kind that we already have and which will continue during the transition agreement. So this idea that they're somehow going to change their mind and say, actually, we've reconsidered Northern Ireland, we're willing to have a different boundary 2 years later, doesn't make any sense. Which leads me to the only plausible justification for the transition period, which I also don't believe, is some potential argument that maybe there was technology needed. We need special kind of lasers or barcodes or checking facilities in Northern Ireland or Calais, and we just don't have enough time to get them ready. I don't believe it. If that was the case, we would have already seen the preparations for these kinds of infrastructure going into place now, and we haven't seen that. So the argument that it's to wait for the technology to catch up, I simply don't believe it. So that leads me to the obvious option that comes before us, which is to reject this arrangement and go for no deal. Now, it's true that I don't think anybody wanted no deal. I didn't want no deal, but now it's the best deal available. I would have preferred a Canada-style free trade agreement, but I believe that no deal is better. And I just want to say, and I think the penny's beginning to drop around the country. Now we're beginning to realize that no deal wouldn't have been as bad as what we've been told all along. First of all, just in the minute or so, or a couple of minutes I have left, on a point of terminology, there's different kinds of no deal that have been bandying around. The chances of a no deal, or sort of no deal squared, meaning complete breakdown of relationships with the EU, is very unlikely. There's a very good chance, in fact, we're already seeing movement on the citizens' rights and airplane landings and all these kinds of things. No deal means no trade deal. We can live quite easily without a trade deal with the EU. Most countries in the world deal with the EU without a trade deal. Yes, there would probably be a blip, there would be an adaptation, there might be a slight retraction, but it would represent a period of adaptation. It wouldn't represent a long-term catastrophe like we've been told. We would deal with the EU on the terms of the World Trade Organization. The tariffs are already quite low on most goods, around 3.5%. Yes, they're higher on some things like cars and agricultural products, but we would be able to have lower tariffs on a number of other goods getting outside of Fortress Europe, and that would extract gains. Now, that's the tariff point. On the non-tariff point, this is the most controversial area in my little professional world. It's the area that I've received the most abuse for, and this is the issue of the non-tariff barriers. I maintain, and a number of people have agreed with me, as long as the UK retains a regulatory alignment with the EU on product safety and food inspection standards, there is no reason for the EU to be difficult and erect difficult barriers in terms of inspections at the border. The sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barrier to trade agreement of the WTO provide that you cannot impose arbitrary barriers. If the risk hasn't changed, you should not be changing the inspection policies. The inspections should be minimized, you should use technology, and they should be driven by risk analysis. They should not be imposing arbitrary barriers. And if I may, I don't usually quote Twitter, but I'm going to quote you a tweet from this fellow, Jean-Paul Mulot, who's the representative for the Hauts-de-France region on Twitter, the area where Calais is. And he said, quote, "French government has got no plans to close down Calais. Lots of people confused about potential threats around no deal. Customs aren't the issue. Maybe delays due to eventual sanitary controls." Just to repeat, maybe delays due to eventual sanitary controls, meaning if at some point in the future we radically change our inspection policies for sanitary products like food, maybe then you might start to see an increase. Only a small number of products require third-party inspection. Only a small number of products require sanitary inspection. That's manageable if the right infrastructure is in place. Now, on services, yes, the coverage under the General Agreement on Trade and Services is weaker, but it is there. It's weak in particular on cross-border trade and services, but there can be mitigation efforts undertaken. A number of representatives from the financial services sector have said one of the things that can be done is opening up offices in the EU, and they have to be meaningful offices, not just letterbox offices. Fine, that's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost to do some services with the EU. But it's fairly obvious that that could potentially be compensated by a more favorable tax regime, lower taxes, and guess where you get the money from to pay for that? The money that would have been paid to the EU under the withdrawal settlement, or at least a good portion of it, maybe not all of it. There's the question that maybe some of it was on. But there's a good several dozens of billions of pounds worth that could be used to fund tax breaks and other initiatives to assist service industries. I just want to point out, I'm not a crazy person shouting this out that nobody believes me. A number of organizations are now beginning to say this. The group Economists for Britain has pointed this out. The group Open Europe has pointed this out, and the World Trade Organization itself has pointed this out. So I think by no means is a no-deal scenario something we should be terrified about, and I would be hopeful that because the EU will also lose out in a no-deal scenario on the tariffs that we'd be charging them, they will be pressured to want to sign a free trade deal, and I would be hopeful that in a couple of years we might get that Canada-style free trade agreement that we all wanted.
Thank you
I'll
very
stop
much,
there.
David. Thank you very much. John Redwood.
Madam Chairman, there is no cliff edge. There will be no catastrophe. Leaving will be great. It will be good for our economy, and it will restore our national democracy in one fell swoop. I voted leave. Government and Remain told me that if I dared to vote leave, we would end up leaving the single market and the customs union at the same time. I regarded that as a promise, and I now want that promise delivered, because that is exactly what I voted to do, because leaving the single market and the customs union, far from causing trouble, will help us free our economy and will increase our prosperity. Now, we've heard great speeches about why this is a democratic disaster of an agreement. And no member of Parliament who wishes to honour the Conservative or Labour manifesto of the last election could conceivably vote for it. And no member of Parliament who believes that we need to restore a vital, vibrant, sovereign Parliament answerable only to the UK voters could possibly vote for this agreement. It gives you practically the whole schmozzle of the EU without vote and voice, and without the right to get out. Now, I voted to reject the EU treaties, not to invent a couple of new EU treaties that bound us back in without an Article 50 exit clause, the worst possible outcome, which has succeeded in uniting Anna Soubry and myself in disapprobation of this particular proposition. But I just want to briefly sketch why I think leaving without signing the withdrawal agreement is good economically as well as the right answer democratically. First thing, we would have that 39 billion that they wish to take off us, their main reason for wanting to rush the withdrawal agreement through from the EU side, to spend on our own priorities. Now, there are some things, schools, hospitals, defence, that I think need us to spend more, and this is the safe way of financing it, because this is money we are collecting in taxes already. Let's spend it at home, not sending it to rich countries abroad. Secondly, I want some more tax cuts. I don't think real incomes and spending power are high enough, and it would be great to say to many people working in our country, we're going to make it more worthwhile. Here is the Brexit bonus. And if we spent that 39 billion on a combination of spending increases and tax cuts over the next couple of years, when the bulk of it would be taken from us if we accepted the withdrawal agreement, that is a 2% stimulus to our economy. I never see that in any of the gloomy forecasts out there, but that would be a fact. We would have that money to spend. Any sensible chancellor would spend all or most of it, and it would be a very welcome boost taking us higher. We could have a bit of the American magic, just look how much faster their economy is growing than any European economy as a result of cutting income taxes for individuals and income taxes for businesses at the same time. We could also cut VAT. Now, we were lied to over the years. We were always told that taxation remained a national democratic matter. It was a red line, according to Mr. Blair. But of course, we can't change that in lots of ways. As soon as we're out, we could get rid of that on domestic fuel, we could get rid of that on green products, we could get rid of that on feminine hygiene products. There are a number of things where we have to impose VAT, which are deeply unpopular, and wouldn't that be another great Brexit bonus to show that we are truly taking back control? And it's another bad feature of this agreement that we would still not be able to settle our own taxes if we signed the withdrawal agreement Mrs. May has in mind. Fourth thing, let's take control of our fish and build a British fishing industry and a fish processing industry on the scale we used to have before they crippled it by the common fishing policy. We had a huge decline in domestic fishing and in support industries following 1972 and the capitulation of the then government overfishing as part of the final deal for entry. Let's have our own tariff schedule. First thing we can do when we leave, as we will be full members of the WTO again, is to put out our tariff schedule for trading with the whole world, including the EU. I think quite a few EU tariffs are too high, deliberately penal on non-EU sources of import. And wherever we can't grow whatever it is or make the thing very easily for ourselves, why wouldn't we take those tariffs down to zero? We might get something back for it as a bargain, or we might just do it unilaterally. And where it makes sense for UK competitiveness, why don't we lower the tariffs to provide that extra boost? Now, I hear some manufacturers very worried about getting their imports in. I've got great news for them. There aren't going to be new barriers at our ports, and imports require our ports to cooperate. And I haven't heard this government say they're going to really make it difficult for people to import components or food. But why not make it even easier for those manufacturing here? Why don't we say, once we're out, we'll have zero tariffs on all components coming in for British engineering and automotive factories? Because at the moment we have to charge tariffs on some of those from non-EU sources. Let's give them more competitive choice and reassure them that there will be no new tariffs on EU components coming into the UK. Why don't we have a food and farming policy, building on Mr. Gover's beginning to sketch, which grows much more food for ourselves? Our self-sufficiency in temperate food has fallen very substantially since we've been in the Common Agricultural Policy. With the right policies here at home, we could rebuild our food industries. Let's have our own migration policy, open to talent, open to people with money and excitement, open to people with good family links who have a reason to come here. And we don't want new controls at the border. What we want are controls over two things. One, we don't want lots of people coming in, driving wages down and taking very low paid jobs. So let's have a work permit system for the EU, just as we have a work permit system for the rest of the world. And we can decide how many people to allow in discussion with business, but there must be more control because there's been too many. And second, control is over benefits. We don't even control our own benefit system at the moment. But let's have common rules for the whole world, and let's say you can't just turn up here from a European country and collect in-work or out-of-work benefits. You have to be here for a bit before you qualify, and that I think people would find very reassuring and might help us get wages and productivity up a bit. If we got wages up a bit, the employers will have to put more machine power and investment power behind each worker, which will be good for everybody, because we want a high-wage, high-productivity economy. And above all, we control our own laws, and we've already heard that we won't be able to do that under the agreement, and there are laws which do not provide the right answer for more jobs and more competitiveness. Now, we don't want a race to the bottom. In some areas, we will want higher standards, and I and others like me have been crystal clear. We have no wish to erode or undermine any of the employment standards which we have jointly developed in the European Union. But there are other areas of regulation where we could have regulations which were friendlier to creating more jobs and creating better and more flexible product. The EU puts everybody in a straitjacket, wanting to set out in detailed legislative leaden prose exactly how everybody does everything, whereas we want a country based on innovation and choice and enterprise and excitement, and they try and squeeze all the life out of it. Every one of those 585 pages is like a dead hand on anybody with ideas, vim, get up and go, innovation, excitement, people who welcome the digital revolution. The EU doesn't like the digital revolution because the Americans are making more money out of it, so they're trying to find ways of doing it damage and hold it back. So ladies and gentlemen, Brexit is a huge set of opportunities. It needs a government that will take advantage of them. It needs a government which will not sign us back into all the worst features of the European Union scheme. We need to grasp the opportunity, understand that we're going to be better off, and above all, we are going to be free.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the meeting to a close. I want you to thank our panel very, very much for taking us through the options following Article 50, which said we could leave without rejoining, but they have explained very clearly what the implications of present proposals are for the withdrawal treaty. I want to thank you, David Jones, John Redwood and David Collins, and all of you ladies and gentlemen for joining the discussion with such interest. Thank you all very much.